So welcome everybody to Transition Tuesdays. This is the third in our series. And I just want to introduce Jennifer Sullivan. But first, I just want to remind everybody that we are live and this will be recorded. So just keep in mind any confidential information, it will be distributed. So if you have any questions, just try to keep names out of it and just keep that confidentiality in mind. So welcome, Jennifer. And I'm just going to introduce you. Jennifer Sullivan has spent 18 years in both higher education and K through 12 schools supporting students transitioning to colleges. She's worked for 10 years at Thames Academy, a postgraduate program on a college campus as an instructor and director of new student experience and parent programming. She's currently adjunct faculty at the UConn School of Education. She is also the founder of Fast Forward College Coaching, and she is a private executive functioning coach supporting high school and college students with learning disabilities, autism, ADHD, and anxiety. She offers parents consultation and guidance about finding a good fit for college-bound students with disabilities, as well as virtual college readiness workshops for high school seniors. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting to be here and to be part of Transition Tuesday.
Yes.
And we have a surprise, something special that we would like to just mention really quickly. So about 6 months ago, I published my first book, Sharing the Transition to College, Words of Advice for Diverse Learners and Their Families. And so today in the presentation, we're going to be giving away 5 copies of the book. And I believe as well to some of you who aren't in the Zoom room, I'm happy to give some away for our Facebook Live participants as well. And so you'll be notified about this at the end of the presentation. The lucky winners will receive an email notifying you that you've won a free book. Yeah.
Exciting. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen here, so bear with me for just a moment.
Okay. And while you're doing that, just want to remind everybody, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat and we can ask questions as we go along.
All right, so here we go. So again, welcome to Transition Tuesday. We're so glad that you're able to carve out a little bit of time in your busy schedule to be here with us. If you're on Zoom or if you're watching on Facebook. So we're going to be talking today about the transition to college and things that diverse learners, so students as well as their families, can be preparing and can be getting ready for now, whether your student is a high school student that's a freshman, sophomore, junior, or a senior, or if your student is outside of high school and are thinking about going to college maybe for the first time. The presentation is really packed full of information. I really wanted to give you as much information as I could about this really important transition. And there is going to be time at the end of the presentation to ask questions. But again, we really encourage you to be interactive and to engage. So if there are questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Just to tell you, a little bit about myself again. So my background really is in higher education and in supporting diverse learners from the higher ed end of the K through 12 and higher ed spectrum. So I have taught across 4 different colleges and universities. And so I kind of approach this presentation knowing the skills that successful college students need. About 15 years ago, I was a founding member of Thames Academy on the Mitchell College campus. And at that time, that program was extremely innovative and kind of one of the only in the country. And that's really where I fell in love with supporting and found my passion for supporting diverse learners and their families. I saw that the year between high school and college as such an important year. And I found myself giving a lot of advice to students and families kind of once they had already started college, in that first year. And so this presentation and the book that I wrote are about helping families and educators to have the information that you need to be successful before you start college. So these are things that, again, educators can use with students in their general ed classrooms, use in special education classrooms, transition coordinators can use this information, but families can also use this information again, before, as early as you want to, before college. All right, so we're going to start with the good news. So the good news is, this is a great time. I would say within really the last 15 to 20 years, this is really the best time, I think, to be going to college. If you have a diverse learner, if you have a student with a learning disability, physical mobility challenge, a mental health challenge, this is a great time to be going to college because there are so many opportunities. College isn't just 4 years or nothing. It's not just going to college or employment. There are so many different pathways. And really, I think kind of the transition year, this post-grad program, kind of that niche, I guess, has really exploded in the last 10 or 15 years. And there are so many different types of programs that can really fit your students' needs and really help them to be successful. So there are, colleges that have kind of these embedded, support programs. There are transition programs. There are transition programs where your student can live on campus, live on a college campus. There are transition programs where your student can be a commuter if they want to do that. There are also programs that districts and schools have as well for the transition year. So there really are a plethora of opportunities if your young adult wants to go to college. So that is the great news. So really, if you can take away, nothing else, from the presentation, I find, again, in my experience in teaching in higher education, but also my experience as an executive functioning coach, the trick to college success is really helping your student to learn a brand new system. And it's not just one big system, it's one big system with lots of little systems embedded in it. And so this presentation is going to help you learn a little bit about those kind of embedded systems and give you and your students information now before they go to college to practice, maybe to role play, to talk about in a classroom and have a discussion before, to get them ready proactively before they go to college. So here we go. There's going to be a lot of information, and again, feel free to ask questions, and this PowerPoint is in the chat box. All right, so we're going to start with the question why. So why are disability supports different for high school and college, right? We need to create a foundation. So the foundation really is kind of based in the law, and you may know this information already, but there are different laws that support students in high school and in college. So the law that supports students and kind of that watches out for students, right, that allows students equal access in high school is the IDEA. And this law protects students from birth through high school. And then after high school, a new law kind of takes over and protects students, and that's the Americans with Disabilities Act. So as you probably know, so in high school, the responsibility for identifying and supporting students is the responsibility is on the school. So the schools will provide information, will provide accommodations, will provide modifications, right? And they're responsible for kind of coordinating all of that support. In college, the responsibility is on the student. So the law does require that schools provide equal access to education. And it only uses the words reasonable, that colleges and universities should provide reasonable accommodations. And we're going to talk about that word reasonable throughout the presentation because what reasonable is can vary from one college to the next. But if I could emphasize one point on this slide, it's that the responsibility in college is on the student to seek out and to coordinate their supports. Okay. So again, I really like this slide because it talks about some of the key differences between high school and college. The very last slide of my presentation, I have some worksheets, some links to worksheets and resources that I've created and resources that are, kind of out there, on the internet that I found to be really comprehensive, really user-friendly. And so there is a worksheet similar to this on the last slide that talks about differences between high school and college. And something that I've found in talking to families is that in high school, families most often, assumed that someone in the high school was talking to their student about the differences between high school and college. Someone on the school team, maybe they thought it was the transition coordinator, or they thought that it was the special education teacher, or, a case manager, or a school counselor. And sometimes the school team thought that the parents were talking explicitly about the differences between high school and college. And the truth was probably somewhere in the middle. So my little helpful tip over on the right-hand side, you'll see this Post-it note kind of throughout the presentation. So these are just little things, if I were, talking to you, families that I would suggest that you do. So I would encourage you to really talk explicitly with your students about the differences between high school and college. I also have some worksheets that could be used in a classroom where there are a couple examples of high school, for example, high school teachers and then college professors, how high school tests might be different than college exams. And then there's a couple of empty spaces, a couple of empty boxes for students to fill in and to show that they have learned, differences between high school and college. So again, talking about these differences as early as you can and as explicitly as you can are really important. All right. Now, I'm not a college admissions consultant, but I did want to talk about two questions, that I get asked often about the college application process by families of students that are diverse learners. And so the first question is, should my student take standardized tests? If my student is not a good test taker, should I take these tests? Well, I would say it depends. I think right now the trend is that some colleges, and it's not because of COVID. So pre-COVID, colleges were starting to not require the SATs and the ACTs as a requirement for admission. It was optional, so you could submit them if you wanted to, but some colleges, so the trend was that they were not requiring this. I think in a year or two, it'll be very interesting to see where they go. Even some decisions that they have made within this year, right, because of COVID. I've seen some, conversations online where colleges are saying they may go back to requiring or they may not require. So the answer is really that it varies. And so I would encourage you to reach out to every college that you're thinking about applying to, and talk, honestly to an admissions officer and say, what do you think? The second question that I get asked is whether to disclose or not disclose a disability in the college application essay. Again, I think the answer varies. I've seen some really great, and I've read some really great application essays by students who talk about challenges that they've overcome, in their past related to a disability. I also know, this could be a great way maybe to explain kind of in a narrative form, to explain other kind of application material. So if a student really struggled maybe in their freshman or sophomore year, the essay could help explain that. If there was an extenuating circumstance or a significant challenge in your student's life, maybe related to the disability, you could address that in the essay as well. But anything that you share or your student discloses in the essay cannot be, if it's disability related, cannot be held against them in regards to admission. And we're going to talk about that later in the presentation about the relationship between admissions and the Disability Support Office. Okay, so I'm going to use the word accommodations a lot in this presentation, and that's because that is the word that colleges use when they talk about disability supports. So in high school, your student may or may not have had modifications, which is when the content or the expectation of the content was made different, was either lessened or maybe was the way your student performed and demonstrated their learning was different. In college does not use modifications, they use accommodations. And these are tools, these are strategies or maybe assistive technology that help students to access the information the same way. So I'm going to use the word accommodation a lot. Again, the differences in high school, this was your school's responsibility to identify and to implement accommodations. In college, every student who applies and is accepted to college kind of starts from the level playing field. A college does not know if your student does or does not have a disability, and they won't know unless your student or you reach out to the disability support office. So self-advocacy, as you're going to hear again and again, is extremely important once your student begins and enters college. And then the last tip here under the college column is that students may need to take some extra steps, and this is really unique to college. Students may need to take some extra steps to use the accommodations in college, even if they've been given them. And that I'll delineate that process in a couple more slides. And I have, I've written several articles about this, about accommodations, about why it's important to talk to your student about accommodations. And so I have the links here, down below for you to read. All right, so in college, the way to receive disability supports is to apply with and colleges call it different things depending on the college or university you're in, to apply with the disability support office. Other colleges will call it the accessibility office. So in order to be eligible and receive supports, your student is going to need to provide documentation. Every college requires different documentation. They don't make it easy. So my tip over here on the right, in addition, the websites sometimes of academic support and disability support office are not always easy to find. So what I suggest doing is going to your college or your potential college's website, and this is a great hands-on tip for students to do. This is a great hands-on activity, right? I'll just mention this really quickly, just as an aside. So as I'm sure you've heard, the parent's role in high school can be compared to the driver, right? You're in the driver's seat. Sometimes parents are the captain of the ship, and sometimes for really good reason. But in college, parents, and it will be very clear from day one in college, parents really need to take a back seat. Parents need to be the supporter and not the driver. So I really encourage you, as much as you can of what you hear in this presentation, number one, to share this information with your student, or perhaps have them watch the presentation, along with you, replay it back and have them watch. I can't tell, I can't see behind all the cameras, but maybe there are some high school students watching right now, and that's really great, if you are. Even if your parents made you watch, this is really, really important information for you. But any of these exercises and activities, I really encourage you to bring back and have your student do. So have your student go to their college website, right, or potential college website, have them find the search bar, first of all, right? Let's not take anything for granted, right? We're going to break this down into small steps. Have them type in the word disability in the search bar. 99 out of 100 times in the search results that you get, the very first search result is the disability support office. Okay, so that's a really easy way to find it instead of clicking on headings and scrolling and trying to find something that can be hidden. Okay, so once you've typed in the search bar, once you've found the disability office, the website, so you're going to look and see what kind of documentation is required. Documentation is absolutely required. We're going to talk about, later on, some supports and services that campuses have that don't require documentation. But if your student would like to receive accommodations, they will need to provide documentation. So what do they need? So the documentation usually needs to be dated within 3 years. That's the number that I've consistently seen, within 3 years. So it might be something to think about, right? If the last time your son or daughter was assessed was freshman year, by the time they apply to college, will that documentation be outdated? You can include an IEP or a 504, and this is really important. I've heard a lot of myths around this. You can include an IEP or a 504 to suggest or to show, to demonstrate accommodations that have been used in the past, but colleges are not required to follow your student's IEP or 504. And that's really important. Again, it can be really helpful to guide a disability staff member in accommodations that have been used in the past, but it is not a guarantee that those same accommodations will apply in college. And sometimes the name of the accommodation could be different. So I'm trying to think. So for an example, if a student had seating, maybe seating in the front row in their high school classroom, a college accommodation that would be, similar might be preferential seating. Okay, so even the wording of accommodations may be different. And lastly, I highly recommend that you do this before the fall semester begins. Once your student is accepted, have that contact, have that communication with the Disability Support Office and get this process started. Maybe I'll do a couple more slides if that's okay, and then pause for a moment to ask questions. I don't want to talk and give you too much information, but if the group at that point would like me to keep going and we'll ask questions at the end, that's perfectly fine too. So here's some examples of typical college accommodations, and and these are pretty typical across a variety of colleges. As an executive functioning coach, I am based in southeastern Connecticut, but I do support students across the country. I do that virtually. So these are accommodations, whether students are going to college in Florida or Ohio, California, Connecticut, these are pretty standard accommodations. And they are listed in these categories for a reason. So if your student qualifies for accommodations in college, often they will be separated into classroom accommodations and testing accommodations. Classroom accommodations are accommodations that your student will automatically have and will use beginning the very first day of class. Here's where the extra step comes in. Testing accommodations your student has, but in order to use them, they need to request to use them. And I know it may seem kind of silly, right? Why? Well, if my student's already eligible in college, we've provided our papers, they've been found eligible, why is there another step there? Well, I think it's for this reason. So let's say, for example, your student uses or has extended time. And in their class, right, it doesn't matter whether it's, well, most often if it's an in-person class. So let's say the test is 2 hours, right? And your student's eligible for extended time. That professor, that class may only last 2 hours. If your student's entitled to extended time, which is usually time and a half, right, which would be 3 hours, there may be another class coming into that classroom. And so your son or daughter can't sit for 3 hours there. So usually in testing situations, your student will apply for these testing accommodations. And that application, that request, goes to the Disability Support Office. In the Disability Support Office, often is a place where students will take their testing or they're taking their exams because they can use these accommodations, in the Disability Support Office. Again, for example, if your student uses speech to text software, right? So that could be Dragon Naturally Speaking, it could be Google Voice Typing, right? They probably would not want to do that in the classroom while everyone else is taking an exam for 2 hours. So again, the disability office needs to make sure that they have a private room, set aside and ready at the time that your student would be utilizing their testing accommodations. So that's why there's an extra step there. And then lastly, so in the bottom corner, your student may not have had residential accommodations, right, in high school because maybe they weren't living in the high school, but there may be some things now in this new environment that they do need. So for example, that mailbox, that may be a combination lock. If your student has, struggles with fine motor skills, you can absolutely ask, or the office can determine your student eligible for a number mailbox keypad. Again, other types of accommodations might be, a first floor room. If the dormitory doesn't have an elevator and your student has a need for a first floor room, that would be a residential accommodation. It would still be requested through the same office though, through the Disability Support Office. All right, so what does it mean to register, and I just talked a little bit about this. What does it mean to register versus to actually use and to request accommodations? So here are 3 steps kind of for each. I tried to make this kind of as simple as possible. So when a student registers, so you are brand new, your student is brand new to college. So the first thing you should do is to apply by usually completing a form that's on the Disability Office website, and then by sending in disability documentation. Okay, so parents, you can still be involved at this point, right? Your student is brand new, they haven't moved in yet, and they're filling out information, they're kind of applying to the office, they're letting the campus know that I'd like to apply for disability supports, and then you're going to send in some documentation. Okay, at this point, parents and educators, you step out of the equation. Usually, if it's the very first time that your student is requesting supports, an in-person meeting is what the college will require. And I know now, this is happening a lot over Zoom, it's happening virtually, but the student will need to meet with a disability staff member, and the student will need to explain their disability. And secondly, the student will need to explain what accommodations they've had in the past that have helped them, and or what accommodations they think will be helpful in college. So you can see right here, if these conversations haven't happened yet in high school, today would be a great time to start these conversations. So no, parents are usually not allowed in the room. Parents are not allowed to be on the Zoom meeting. This is your student advocating for themselves and explaining their disability to a stranger. So again, this is a great thing to practice. Your student may have had practice, maybe with their special education teacher, or maybe with you, mom or dad or grandma, explaining what their disability is and how it affects them. But can they do it with a stranger? Can they advocate for themselves with someone that they don't know? Again, that's a great thing to practice. And then step number 3, if your student is a returning student, so if this is second semester or if it's sophomore year in college, they don't need to do this in-person meeting, but they do need to apply every semester. And so that's really important to know. I encourage you to do these things before they start the fall, but they're going to need to do them again in the spring. And some of you might be thinking, well, why is that? Why would you need to do that? Well, your student will have different classes in the spring semester. So they may not have needed a calculator in the fall semester because they didn't have a math class. But if that's one of their accommodations and they have a college algebra class in the spring semester, they may need a new accommodation. Or an accommodation that they had in the fall, they may not need in the spring. So that's why students will need to do this at the beginning of every semester. And then, so the right-hand column, so this is how a student, so your student now has started college. They're on the campus by themselves. Parents and educators, you are not there. So here's how your student will request accommodations. Okay, so number 1, they will receive a letter, right? So once they've submitted their documentation, once they have met with the disability staff member, they will be sent letters of accommodation. And these will come either hard copy, where your student will have to pick it up, or they will be sent via email. Number 2, your student will need to give this letter to the faculty member in any course that they would like to request accommodations in. It could be an in-person meeting, or it could be via email. And then number 3, we've already talked about this. In testing situations, your student will need to request again, right? So there's another online form to use those testing accommodations. And there is usually a deadline, right? So for students that may have executive functioning challenges, I mean, I'm sure parents, you're already thinking, how is my student going to manage all of these steps, right? All of these new steps that they have never done before. Well, one answer to that is practicing and starting talking about it now. So if it's all right, can I pause here for a moment and see if anyone has questions or see if there's anything in the chat room.
There's nothing in the chat room right at this
Okay.
moment.
Okay. Okay. All right. I think everyone is so captivated, they would just like me to keep going.
Does anybody have any questions?
Okay, well. All right, I will just keep going then. All righty, whoops. Here we go. Okay. All right, so number 4, students need to be able to explain how their disability impacts them. And, and we just mentioned, self-advocacy and practicing this. So as you could see, from the previous slide, that there are opportunities where your student's going to need to have a conversation, and a conversation with someone in the disability support office, with a faculty member, right, when they hand that letter of accommodation. And trust me, as a faculty member, I've been on the receiving end of many of the just drop and goes where students don't feel comfortable having that conversation, and they will just drop the letter on my desk or on the table, and then they will leave. I think it's good practice as a faculty member to say, no, wait, let's, talk to me for a minute, tell me, tell me beyond the words that are on this letter, tell me in your own words, what this means for my class, what can I do to help you, right? That's essentially what this letter is saying. So, some faculty will do that, and they will want to have a communication. It doesn't have to be long, right? But kind of, having students prepare that elevator speech length, just a couple of sentences about their disability and what they may need, in a classroom is important. I've heard, advice from some counselors that say, that it's best maybe not to have, or maybe parents feel more comfortable not having themselves explain the disability to their student, but maybe having an outside professional do it. Sometimes that can depersonalize the conversation. So having, your student's therapist or psychiatrist or counselor kind of explain to them, their disability and what it might mean for college. All right, so I think it's really important just to have conversation and to have communication with the disability support office. It could be a phone call, it could be a virtual meeting. I highly recommend that you visit the office, if you're on a campus tour. Admissions officers aren't always going to show you this office. I find, though, that if you're looking at colleges or universities that are really disability friendly, that do have really, a wide range of supports for diverse learners, then they probably will highlight this on their campus tour, and that's a really great thing. But don't be afraid to say, after the tour, we'd like to see the accessibility office. Can we stop over there? Can we talk to someone? Again, asking about the types of documentation that's required and the types of support that are available. And that will be coming, in the next slide. It's important to know that the disability office is not connected with the admissions office. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, that the admissions decision, cannot be affected in any way by your student disclosing their disability. Don't also assume that the admissions office will forward, any disability documentation, or if your student writes about a disability, in their essay, don't assume that information that they will forward your student's file to the disability office, because that won't happen. Your acceptance letters will come from the college, and then it will be your student's responsibility to make a separate phone call or a separate email to the disability office and then start that process. But it is important to, again, to do this proactively. This is the office that's going to be supporting your student's disability. And once they, step foot on campus, communication is going to be with your students, not with, parents and caregivers, unless your students sign a release of information form that would allow the campus to communicate with anyone that they have named, on that form. Okay, and yep, so there's another worksheet at the end of the presentation to help you organize all of this information. All right, I really, really like this slide. If you're going to take a screenshot, if you're going to take a picture with your phone, this is one of the slides to do it with. Different colleges have different levels of support for diverse learners. And it's really important to know. So when you're on a campus tour or when you're at a virtual open house and the school says they're supportive, to inquire a little further, to dig a little deeper and ask what that means. So on the left-hand column, these are supports that are mandated by law. There is no fee, right, for these supports. Any student who is eligible, any student who can submit documentation to verify a disability is able to have these supports. It's administered by the disability office, right, or the name of your particular college office. It could be accessibility office. It could be disability student support office. And your student needs to request these services. This office will not seek out your student. The middle column, these are what I called academic services. These are things that are pretty standard now at all colleges and universities. These are things like a writing center, right? Peer tutoring, a math center. There might be peer support groups. Again, there's no fee for these services. They're available to any student, right, with or without a disability. There is no documentation, and they're administered by an academic success center professional. So these professionals don't necessarily have a background in disabilities. It could be a college writing faculty member that's running the writing center, but is not necessarily someone that has a background in dyslexia. And then the right-hand column. So these are probably supports that if you have done research, and I know there are families out there, there are parents out there who, as soon as your child started high school, you already started thinking about what college is going to mean. And you are a researcher and you will find, any and every piece of information you can. You have read the best colleges for students with disabilities lists. You have bought the books. So these are probably, the right-hand column is probably the schools that you're looking at right now. So these are colleges and universities that have supports above and beyond what is required by law. Above and beyond means that if you feel like your son or daughter will need one-on-one support, and I'll talk about what that means in a second, in college, then you are going to want to look for a college that has these comprehensive supports. They're not free. Astoundingly, they could cost $3,000 per semester, depending on the number of times your student will visit with them. Usually the people providing this service are learning specialists. So they may have a background in special education. They may have, professional development training. They may have some certificates in, executive functioning skills, perhaps, in Orton Gillingham support, those types of specialty, areas of training. The number of times your student can access these programs really depends on what you're willing to pay for and what your student needs. So if you would like someone to check in with your student, once a week to help them organize assignments, right, then that once a week support wouldn't be as expensive as if you wanted your student to check in 3 times a week. And that's about the maximum that any college that I've seen will provide these extra supports. So comprehensive supports are, can be found in colleges, for example, like Landmark College or Mitchell College or Beacon College or Lynn University or maybe Lesley University or Curry. Those types of programs have this extra kind of more comprehensive levels of support. Just going to see if anybody has any questions in the chat.
Yes, I was just going to say there's a few.
Oh, sure.
Great. So the first question is, what if the accommodations in college are not similar to the IEP modifications when a student has a learning disability?
Okay, that's a great question. You know, I have found that, and again, and this is within, 15 years, that I have been specifically in kind of, disability supports. I found that they are pretty similar. Students are able to go back to a college disability support office and ask for an additional accommodation to be added. Colleges, we don't call it an appeal, but if your student is given a faculty letter of accommodation, and let's say there's something that's missing, for example, I find most often that's missing when I work with students. I work with students that would really benefit from copy of the professor's notes. And I find sometimes that is missing from their letters of accommodation. So I encourage, the student, not the parent, to go back to the disability support office, and they're going to need to advocate and say why they feel like they need that accommodation. And sometimes they may need to bring documentation, that says why that accommodation will be helpful. And I just want to mention really quickly about that. So getting a copy of the professor's notes is an accommodation. However, most colleges will allow the faculty member to choose how he or she will fulfill that accommodation, which means it may not necessarily be a peer who's sitting in that class. This is what it used to be. way back when, it used to be a student who's in that class that took really neat, had really neat handwriting and notes, and would have their notes photocopied, and then that photocopy would be sent to the anonymous student in the class, who needed access to the notes. Now, most often, college professors will post their notes online, on the learning platform, which is really great because it's really a form of universal design, right? That all students can have access to the notes, whether or not, it's a disability related accommodation. But so then it means that your student just needs to go online to the learning management system and to find the notes. So that's how, they would find that accommodation. Okay. But that's a great question. So it is possible for your student to feel like something's missing and then to go back to the office. And most often I found that if your student advocates, then they will add an accommodation.
Great, thank you. There is one on Facebook, and it says, does this apply for community colleges? Can you give a list of colleges that are disability friendly?
Yeah. Can you tell me again the first part of that question? I'm sorry.
Does this apply to community colleges?
Yes. Yep. That's a great question. Yes, so it does. It does apply to community colleges. Particularly, I find that community colleges have the left column and the middle column of supports. So, every single college, is mandated by law to provide accommodations. So every college is mandated to have an office or a person that provides disability support for that campus. I find community colleges are really great at the middle column here, these academic services. They really have enhanced, supports and services for students. And I think it's great, again, because it's a form of universal design. Community colleges sometimes have, a different student population, or maybe, a non-traditional age population, or just kind of by nature, where they're located. And so I find they have a lot of really great academic services, that middle column.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are a smaller number of schools that have this right-hand column, the comprehensive supports. And although there really are a lot more that are popping up now, and I'll say particularly for students with autism, a lot of colleges and universities, and especially, engineering and technical schools, I'm finding, are really being innovative in having programs that support students with autism. But again, some of the ones that have kind of been in the field, I guess maybe have more of a history of supporting students with disabilities, would be Landmark College, Curry, maybe Leslie University, Mitchell College, Beacon College down in Florida, Lynn University also down in Florida. And I know there are colleges across the state, but you can tell, those are the New England colleges that I most know about.
The next question, is the process the same with going to a technical school like Porter and Chester compared to a 2 or 4-year college?
That's a great question. I don't want to give you a definite answer. I don't know a definite answer. I have my assumption, but I don't want to misstate that. So my assumption is yes, that the IDEA covers students from K through 12. And so the Americans with Disabilities Act, covers students in employment as well as in, other settings after they have graduated high school. So I would assume that includes a Porter and Chester as well. But I am going to research that after this presentation. So if you would like to email me, my contact information is on the presentation. I'd be happy to find that out and talk to people, that I know, and to get that answer for you. Great.
Thank you.
Good questions.
That's the last question so far.
Okay, great. So I'm going to keep going. We're almost at the end of the presentation. Let's see. Okay. So this is my personal opinion. This is my opinion from working with students who have not done this, which creates the foundation for why I am giving this as a tip. I really encourage families and students to put accommodations in place in college, even if your student insists they don't want to. I absolutely respect students who say they want to do college on their own. Particularly students who may have been supported through special education, through K through 12. I've heard a lot of students say, I want to try it on my own. I don't want to meet with a special education teacher. I've had a lot of appointments and meetings, and I want to try this on my own. I understand that, but I find the better way to go about that, and kind of for two reasons, is to say, parents to say, let's sign up with the office and show me that you don't need these supports. So that would be my first reason, is to say, let's put these supports in place, but then show me that you don't need them, and then you don't have to register again next semester, right? But two, so the other reason, and it's in the upper left-hand column here, the upper left corner, once a student registers on campus with the disability office, that does not obligate them in any way. It is not a contract. They do not have to use their accommodations. So a student can submit documentation, they can have a meeting with the disability staff member, they can get their letter of accommodation, and then decide that they don't want to give those letters to their faculty member. I don't recommend that, but so in no way is it a contract. So this is what I use when I'm working with students that are struggling in college. And really one of my first questions is, have you registered with the disability office? Probably 9 out of 10 times, and this is just in my experience, 9 out of 10 times they say, no, I haven't. So registering is a great thing to do before they start the semester, but they don't have to use them. So that might be what I would say, parents, if your student is resistant, is to at least have them sign up and register, but then they don't have to use them. So I created this slide based on, again, my personal experience, right, supporting students. So what I find, and again, so families kind of work with me kind of in two ways. So they'll either, come to me in high school before their student starts college, or after, usually maybe midway through the first semester or second semester when their student is struggling, and they come to me and say help, and I will help put some strategies in place and give suggestions and things like that. So I created this slide actually working backwards. So I started because I had a student in front of me that I was working with who said, I don't think I'm smart enough to do college. The student said, I don't belong here. I thought I could do college, but I'm just not smart enough. So then we worked backwards, right? So if students have that feeling, it's probably because they're struggling, right? Because college is hard. It can be hard. And if the student is struggling and doesn't have accommodations, right? Well, why is that? So we go backwards. It's because, sometimes, and again, I completely understand when students say, I just want to try it on my own, right? And so when I find when students say that, it's because they don't understand, working backwards, what helps them to be successful, right? There may be accommodations that are being put in place in high school that are part of their IEP or their 504 that students don't even know that they're there. They don't even know that those things are accommodations. And so working backwards to the left, right? If this path sometimes can be diverted if we start talking about accommodations in high school. And if we start calling things what they are, if a student receives extended time, or if a student receives graphic organizers or outlines, or meets with a school counselor to help organize assignments, to say these are things that have helped you be successful in high school. So now let's try to replicate these same supports in college. So again, I've seen it from the very end, from the right side of this, where students, their end result is they personalize their experience in college and say, maybe I'm just not meant for college. Maybe I just can't do college. But if they had accommodations, and then if they understood that those things were helping them be successful, then the end result may have been very different. Okay, so we are close to the end of the presentation. So if you are an educator, or if you have a freshman, sophomore, or junior, here are some things that you could be doing tonight, this week, the rest of this year. 3 things. Number 1, you can start having your student practice self-advocacy skills. You can have a conversation with them about their disability, right? And this is a very personal conversation. You approach this however you would like, about the disability, and then have them practice explaining to others what their disability is and how it might affect them in college. If you have a student who is a senior and you are a couple months away from graduation, so number 1, I recommend that before they go to college, that your student creates a list of contacts on campus. These are the people who are going to be your students' go-tos, right? So when your student feels like calling home in that first week because they're struggling with something, you can direct them back to this list that they have made. Number 2, right? I suggest that if your student's been accepted, that that they apply to the Office of Accessibility Services. Again, that they also understand their disability. And then number 4, and I found a great worksheet, which is on the next slide, that talks about researching mental health supports on campus. It is one of the best worksheets that I have found kind of on the internet. And oops, I see a misspelling there. Even if students think that they won't need these services, if your student has or doesn't have a disability, I really recommend that they research mental health supports. All right, so you all have the presentation, you have the PDF, so I encourage you to go to these different links. And this is the last slide of the presentation. I know the presentation was pretty heavy in disability supports and connecting to the disability office and the types of supports. So I just wanted to throw in 5 quick things here that are not necessarily disability related, but I think are really important for families and educators to know. And these tips, and then many more, are in my book. Okay, so the first one is that it's important to know there's not one person in college that's going to be really managing your student's college career. They do have an academic advisor, true, but the academic advisor, to be quite honest and to be quite frank, really will see your student only when it's time to register for classes. So there is not one person who's necessarily overseeing how they're doing in the dorm, how they're doing. Are they managing their schedule? Do they know where their classes are? Do they know where all their Zoom links are for their different classes? How they're doing socially. Are they doing laundry? There's not one person, and that all these different roles are overseen by a variety of different offices that don't always communicate with each other. So I wanted you to know that. Secondly, there's going to be significantly less communication for parents. And this can be really hard, really hard if you've been the primary communicator with your students, in the student's team in high school. So, encourage your student to be checking their email. That's primarily how colleges are communicating right now. But just be ready for less communication. Parents, if you are kind of the main communicator, if you're the person that talks to your student when they're in distress now in high school, you probably are going to continue to be that person when they start college. Sometimes, families are looking forward to an empty nest and they don't want those middle of the night phone calls, but they're still going to happen because for better or for worse, and this is one of my favorite tips in the book, for better or for worse, your students are bringing with them the same tools that they have in high school to college. And if you were that text or that first phone call or that first email, you probably will be, in the beginning of college too. Again, I just encourage you to be proactive, create proactive plans, create proactive lists of, of contacts, excuse me. And then lastly, just be aware that the timing of supports in college is kind of a business schedule. It's pretty typically Monday through Friday and 9 to 5. So I find students who kind of struggle in the beginning of their college career, it usually happens, in the evening. It usually happens on the weekend. And there really are not as many supports in place then. So it might be helpful to think about, clubs or activities that your student can get involved with that are on the weekends or in the evenings. Maybe they have a Zoom call with their aunt or uncle or grandpa, on the weekends. Maybe that's when you help them to structure their time a little bit, and remind them to do homework because that is the time when there's a lot of free time and supports aren't necessarily open on a college campus. So. And, so that is, the end of the presentation. Again, please reach out to me if you would like after the presentation. I know you probably have some very individualized questions, about your student and maybe things you didn't feel comfortable sharing here. But, I really encourage you to reach out. I'm happy to have conversations with you, if your student is a freshman or if they've already graduated and you're thinking about them, going to college. I love talking to families. So. And that is the end of the presentation. So I would love to answer any more questions or see if there's anything in the chat box.
Yes, there is a question in the chat box. What if your local community college only offers minimal accommodations?
Well, and I'm sure there's a lot more behind that question. So I'm going to try to read into what might be behind that. The majority of colleges and universities all have the kind of mandated level of supports, by law. Again, if there's something that you think your student should have that they have not been found eligible to have, your student can, like I said, can go back and can request an additional accommodation. You can even bring evidence. You could bring a letter from a pediatrician, from a therapist, a counselor, a psychiatrist, anything that kind of helps your student to make their case for why they need that accommodation. Did I answer? If you'd like to, feel free to unmute yourself too if you'd like to ask a more specific question. Or if you'd like to think about it, we can go on to another question and then come back to that one too.
No, that was great. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay, you're welcome.
This has been a great presentation. Thank you. It's been very informative.
Oh, you're welcome. Good. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of information for a Tuesday night, but there's a lot to know, and I think the more you know ahead of time, I've seen too many families find out this information too late. So, being proactive and knowing this information ahead of time can really help your students be successful.
There's a question. What is your opinion about taking a gap year?
That's a great question. Well, I feel like I'm a little biased because I worked for 10 years in a gap year. So I can see how they can be really beneficial. I will say though, there are some things to consider. Consider your finances. Some gap year programs, because your student is not a fully matriculating college student, so because the students are not taking 12 full-time college credits, financial aid is not available. So that's a really big, I've seen that be a really big determining factor for families who are on the fence. And if finances are a concern, which I think they are for all of us, the difference of going to a supportive college, that where the family can have financial aid versus having their student attend a gap year, where they would be really financially strapped, that helps to make the decision. But with that being said, there are some really great, transition programs. Some schools and districts are providing transition programs, but there are also some where students can live at, a particular gap year program and then take 1 or 2 classes at a local college and then go back to that program that will help support them, academically, and help support them with some of these executive functioning skills as well. So consider finances, but I've also seen it where the investment of that money in a gap year program helps students build skills that if they had jumped into the fall year of college, the student may not have been as successful.
There is a question on Facebook. Are there transition programs to help the student prepare for college?
Yes, there are a lot of them. I would say that the main difference that I see in some of these transition programs is if they are actually, on a college campus. There are some transition programs, like I just mentioned, where the student is not, or where the program is not on a college campus. It's someplace separate where a small number of students might live together. So it might be 10 students, it might be 15 students living together. And then they, go to the college, take classes, at the college, then come back. For some families, their student really wants that residential experience. They really want the experience of living on a college campus. And so in that case, you can explore transit. And so that's what I would actually type in, right? If you're Googling, you could type in transition programs on a college campus. There are, like I mentioned, there are other transition programs. This is they're popping up all over because I think colleges and high schools are realizing this is what students need. And then again, schools and districts do have transition programs as well.
And it actually looks like there's someone who has an IEP meeting coming up and will be contacting you. So they said, thank you very much for this information. It was helpful.
Oh, good. You're welcome. Yep, you're welcome. And again, I know these are really, the transition to college is, well, every student is so unique. I have 2 daughters, and I realized I didn't mention this in the beginning of the presentation. I have a high school daughter and a middle school daughter as well. And I'm, involved in the special education process. And I know that, each of my daughters is unique and their needs are unique. And it can be scary thinking about leaving from what you've created, in high school and going to college. But there's some really great options out there, some, really great programs. And again, there are a lot of really innovative options. So it does not have to just be a traditional, live on campus for 4 years, take 4 classes a semester. There are a lot of creative options.
I'm looking to see if there's any other questions. Looks like that's it. Anybody have any questions?
Thinking they're probably digesting. It's a lot of information, they're digesting it, and I'm sure they'll reach out to you CPAC if they have questions.
Absolutely. So I am actually going to launch a poll for your feedback, and it's very valuable. And so we can make sure that we're getting you the information that is needed. And it'll pop up in the chat. Great.
Can I ask, has anyone, if you feel comfortable sharing, are you going through the application process right now? Are you deciding between a few colleges, or have you started investigating supports on college campuses?
Hi, this is Melissa. I'm in the process right now. I have a 17-year-old that's a senior graduating in June. So yeah, so applications and trying to call and schedule like Zoom meetings and tours and all of that fun stuff. So yeah, and he's one of 3, so I get to redo this in 3 years because I have 3 boys. So yeah.
Wow. Oh my gosh. So you must have no free time right now.
Yeah, and all 3 of them have learning disabilities. So they so they keep me on my toes. Never a dull moment either. So but
Wow.
yeah.
That's great. That's so great. Well, I would encourage your son to be really involved in this, and you may already be doing this, but have him, make those phone calls to set up those Zoom meetings. Have him write those emails. If you're interested in that worksheet on the last slide, it will help you kind of organize information so he can say, oh, this is the college that I've spoken to on this date. Here's the type of disability information documentation that they need. Here's the name of the director of that office. Here's his or her email.
Yeah, he's good at calling. He's not so great at documenting everything. That's kind of like where I come in. He's more of the verbal than the written type. So yeah, but I mean, even when he was younger, like he got diagnosed in 3rd grade with his learning disability, and then once he hit like 5th grade, he would actually come to like his own IEPs meetings and and advocate for himself. So he's really good at verbally. It's just writing everything down is where he kind of struggles.
Yeah.
So, but yeah,
that's wonderful. He sounds like a wonderful young man.
Yeah, thank you. And great presentation too. Thank you. I appreciate it. So.
Oh, you're welcome. Yep, you're welcome. Good luck with that college search. Yeah.
Thank you.
If you need anything, if you have any questions, reach out to CPAC, or myself.
Oh, I definitely will. Thank you.
I just wanted to say hi, Melissa. Glad you were here. I haven't seen you or heard your voice in a long time.
I know, since partners. I know it's been a couple years.
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay, there we go. Now I can see you. Now you can see me.
There you are.
So yeah. So I kind of like got kicked in the kitchen. So everybody's like walking back and forth. So I've had my my video off because of that. So late night snacking and getting ready for bed and everything. So yeah. So I have 3 boys. Like I said, I have he's gonna be 18 in September, and then I have one that's gonna be 16 in June, and then a 12-year-old. So yeah.
So you'll have this down by the 3rd time you go through this.
I'm hoping by the 2nd one. I'm hoping after all of this, I pretty much got it down after this. That's what I'm hoping, but we'll see what happens. So if not, I'll be making lots of phone calls to you guys. So but anyway, all right.
A couple more questions on Facebook that popped up. So one person said they're deciding between UConn, Stanford, Southern, and Central. Lots of choices.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the high school has a 2-year transition program, but does that mean he has to stay at high school, or they help him with transition to and travel to college?
That's a great question. I have a little bit of experience with that, so I don't know if I should turn that over to Beth or to Laura to answer that. I'll just share in my experience. So it really depends on your district. It depends on your school. I have experience where schools have provided some support for a student who was taking an online class or was taking one class, at a local college, and then would receive some support from that, through that particular district's transition program. I don't know. Can I ask, Beth or Laura, what your experience is?
Yeah, I would just say that I think I would support what you said. It's really individualized. That's a very specific, that would be a conversation. Well, what are the needs of the student? What are the goals of the student? Yeah, so I would say probably giving us a call and having that conversation. Laura, what do you think?
I would agree, because it's so individualistic and it just depends on what the needs are, what the discussions have been in the meetings and whatnot. So we definitely give us a call so we can go through that with you.
I would add that there's no one size fits all to any transition program. Just because it's there doesn't mean it's the right fit for that individual student.
Right, it's based on the student's needs, not necessarily what the district has or doesn't have, so.
Mhm. Yeah, great questions.
Question saying, someone wants to know if he will take a certificate of completion first. So I'd like to dive into that question a little bit more before going to college. I'm not sure, so if you can repost the question with a little more detail.
So I think that lends itself to a good question. And I'm sorry if somebody already asked this. I was late to the presentation today. But Jen, in your experience, for a while, there were only a few community colleges that were accepting students that hadn't taken their diploma and that were still under the umbrella of the school district. I was finding that that was not the case anymore for most schools. What are you seeing? Most community colleges, I should say. What are you seeing? Are pretty much most community colleges allowing students to not have the diploma if they're being supported by the school district? Or
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, in my experience, yeah, and it depends on, so I always encourage students, to reach out to the admissions office, of that community college and say, I'm this number of, years old. Here's my situation. I'm in a transition program, beyond 12th grade, and I'm being supported by my school, but I would still like to take a class. And also, auditing classes is another option too. That's something that I've talked to some high school, students about in a transition program. If they don't want to enroll for credit, community colleges are very open to a student auditing a class, and just to get the experience of maybe taking an online class, looking at a syllabus, taking an exam. What does a college level writing assignment look like? And that can definitely, absolutely happen if a student's still being supported through a high school. Yeah.
Great.
Okay. There is, the comment was, they're saying if he takes the diploma, they will wash their hands, but a certificate will guarantee 2 more years of help. I'm going to assume that's the high school saying that.
Yeah, but then the question is, what does that help look like? What is the appropriate program for? Because yes, if the student takes the diploma, then the school district does not have an obligation anymore to that student. So
Right. Once they take the diploma, that's it. They've graduated. They're done.
mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah, I would say, it seems like, a lot of questions, parents are thinking about, or they're asking about transition programs in their district versus going right to college, or the types of supports that are at college. And I think, as Beth and Laura have said, to have a conversation, right, with your district and say, what types of support can you provide, or again, thinking about those conversations you've already had. What are my students' strengths? What are their needs, and can these things be met in college? Or if not, can they be met, under the umbrella of the school, and really having really honest conversations, right? And saying, or I'm looking at this college and here's what they offer, but I don't know. And so just kind of asking point blank, really just kind of putting it out there and making sure everyone's on the same page.
And currently, right now, students can remain up to age 22 in high schools, depending on their needs. They may or may not need that full, all those years. And again, it's a PPT decision and based on the needs and the discussion.
Yeah, something that I families will ask about too is not just the support, but what type of, residential, meaning, living situation. Some students really may need the academic support, but say, I really want to be on a college campus, or I want to be in a gap year program where I'm surrounded by other students, beyond just my high school. So if your student is in a very small high school, experience right now, maybe that residential component is really important for them. Yeah, so there's lots of things to consider.
All the questions are coming in now. What if what if your 12th grade student won't accept her or his learning disability and never has, but needs help? That's a tough one. Get that a lot.
Yeah, I feel that question. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I would kind of start with, the students' kind of own self-awareness of things that are difficult for them and things that are easy for them, in school. That's kind of how I start. So I won't necessarily use the word disability, but I'll say, so tell me about your classes. Tell me about things that are really easy for you, or tell me that things that are difficult for you. And sometimes students will say something is difficult for them. And then you can kind of make connections. It depends also if you've used the words, if the family has used the words disability, or if professionals have used the words disability. I also like to talk about, the number of students in college that have disabilities, and that, that we all kind of use different types of support, right? So, when I dictate into my phone, when I'm making my grocery list, when I'm, using my phone to take pictures of things because I can't remember, so I just am very honest, and say, these are my strategies. These are things that support my brain in the way that I learn, things that I'm good at and not great at. And there's probably things in all of our brains that we're good at and not good at, and kind of starting the conversation that way. I mean, it can be hard. It can be really hard to own, sometimes some students, really feel like that's a label, or they feel like, and I don't know if your 12th grade student, has been in special education, and I know there's a lot more behind that question. But it may not be a conversation maybe that the student wants to have, with a parent or guardian. Sometimes just an objective person, having a conversation can kind of create that bridge that's very non-judgmental. I try not to be non-judgmental as a parent, but there are things my daughter will talk about with other people and she won't talk about with me. And that's okay, because I just want her talking about them. So sometimes bringing in, a third perspective might help your 12th grader kind of get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, we get that question a lot, don't we, Laura? It's really common.
Yeah, it's hard. It's because I can understand as a parent. However, you have to respect the individual as well, and it gets very complicated depending on the situation, and it's hard. As
We
parents,
have often also get the call that a student wanted, like Jen was saying earlier, wanted to go into college with no supports, no accommodations, whether they just don't accept it, or they just think it's a clean slate and I'm going to start off, fresh and new at this new school. And, I think that's, such good advice to try to get them to, at least, even if they don't use it, to have it available to them, because they can't go back once they fail a class. They can't go back to the professor and say, oh, well, really, I have a disability and really I needed this accommodation. But you lose the class, you lose your money, and that person has to take the class over again. So it's also good if they're having those challenges, you know, and I love community colleges for so many reasons, not just because they're affordable, but it may be better to trial that in a community college where you're paying a lot less for credit than you are at, you know, one of the more expensive schools, St. Joe's or something, a private college. So that's often, you know, one thing that we talk about with families, like, yeah, we know Connecticut, everybody needs, you know, really wants to go to the Ivy League, but maybe that's not the best place to start. Maybe work up to that, you know,
Right,
see how
right.
it goes,
Definitely.
kind of figure it out first.
Yes,
Tough situation though, for sure.
it is for sure. It is. And sometimes I agree that third person having that conversation, it's a, you know, there's no judgment, and parents can, you know, they have certain expectations that may or may not be realistic, or they may be, the student doesn't want to be pushed so much and just isn't comfortable talking to their family member about it, and where a third person can have those honest conversations.
Oh yeah, I'm incredibly grateful for the people that have connected with, you know, my kids that wouldn't maybe accept advice from mom.
Yep.
Mhm.
Wow. These are such great questions. Anything else, or?
No, no other questions.
All right,
This is great.
great. Such great questions. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. You know, thank you for taking your time on a Tuesday, you know, to learn and think about, you know, this really kind of scary next step. You know, but I think we really believe that the more information you have, you know, the better you are. And again, involve your son and daughter in as much of this as you can. Start that self-advocacy, you know, early. And we'll be emailing right after this presentation. So some of you will be receiving a free, you know, a signed copy of my book. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this opportunity. It was wonderful talking to all of you.
And it's a great book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is great information. Thank you.
Thanks everybody. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.